All right, everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and get started in the sake of time. So like I mentioned again, my name is Kate Edelson. I'm the walk manager here at NAMI Miami-Dade. You are at one of our speaker sessions or Ask the Expert, where we talk to an expert in the field who's going to share relevant mental health information with you all today. So thank you so much again for taking time out of your day to join us. We're really excited that you're here. So it is my great pleasure today to introduce our guest, Bella J. Rockman, sorry, who is a native Detroiter. She works as a social scientist, as a media mental health correspondent, and she is a speaker and licensed neuropsychotherapist. So she does a lot of amazing work in the community. She focuses on nervous system therapy with an emphasis on healing and coaching, especially intergenerational healing. And plus she has that neuropsych background that really ties everything together. So we're really, really thrilled that she's here with us today. I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to her. Go ahead, Bella. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Kate. It's been good getting to work with you a little bit and getting to know you. And hello to Miami-Dade County. It feels a little bit like second home because I've come there often for like outreach events and things like that over the years. So I'm really glad to be here virtually with you all and really honored that you would have me. And thank you and shout out to Vanessa Madrazo, who I've known since probably first grade, but just text me and confirm that or not. I've known her forever. And it's just kind of crazy how sometimes life will align your paths and you end up working in the same field, which is healthcare and mental health care for us. So some of what I'm going to say is going to be a little bit like ad-libbing because I don't want to bore you with a PowerPoint, but I do want to give you some sort of visual aid. Okay. And then towards the end, we will do a little bit of Q&A. So please jot down questions and things like that that you might have or comments that we'll be able to type in the chat, or you might be able to get on the mic and actually ask them. As Kate mentioned, I grew up in Detroit, went to school at the University of Michigan. I live in Texas now. And you know, at one time, I think mental health care was almost like the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, and Santa Claus or something in a lot of communities, as well as in this country as a whole. People were just like, does it even exist? Is it even real? You know, kind of thing. And so I think over time, you know, because mental health care, which was originally established as like mental illness, it was only done from like a disease or sickness model. And there was these stereotypes about, you know, being crazy and being in a funny farm and straight jacket and all this stuff that emerged out of the early 1900s. And then after a while, people realize that, you know, mental health care is a thing, and it's not all just for sick model. It's not all just for crisis. It's actually like, it could be a prevention model and a wellness model. And we've evolved since then, and especially with things like the pandemic and social unrest and political unrest and rising costs of living and things like that. I think people are starting to realize more and more everyone has mental health, or at some time, maybe even mental health challenges or issues, and that can be on a spectrum. So, but to say that you've never had a mental health care issue is almost like saying you've never had a cold or an allergy. Like, it's just kind of a part of humaning and being human. So barriers to mental health care, codes of conduct, and collective cognitive dissonance. And I want to say that although this is Minority Mental Health Care Month, these are barriers that show up for people as a whole, especially because of societal norms. So I don't want you to walk away from this saying, oh, okay, Bella told us this is just for communities of color. This is just for certain populations or demographics. This is really a human issue, but because we're celebrating and acknowledging Minority Mental Health Care Month, we're going to hone in a little bit specifically about some barriers that affect minorities in different ways, perhaps, but similar ways for all of us. Okay, so a little bit about us. If you want to go to your phone or device, you can go to jrocktherapyinstitute.com if you want to keep in touch and sign up for our regular or semi-regular newsletters. They're not weekly for sure, so you won't be inundated. You can also find us if you go to Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook at JRock Therapy. And we have a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and our iHeartRadio called the JRock Report. And we're talking about current events, pop culture, and relevant subject matter through a mental health care lens. So JRock Therapy Academy focuses on behavioral health literacy and education for communities and colleges, first responders. And then our private practice, JRock Therapy, we focus on nervous system regulation, epigenetics, neuropsychology, and intergenerational trauma and healing. What I was going to say is about central nervous system regulation. I don't know if any of you have heard of before Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the body keeps the score. And what happens is we're not able to like think our way out of our trauma. We can't succeed our way out of our trauma. A lot of times when we experience traumatic experiences or situations in our life, what happens is the things that when those events are processed through our brain, oftentimes our neocortex goes offline, which is our logical brain that knows logical things, and our hippocampus goes offline, which is our memory storage system. And oftentimes those traumatic experiences and events get sort of lodged in like our amygdala or our primitive brain. And so oftentimes stressors and trauma can get locked into our system at a cellular level. And that's why we focus on nervous system regulation and somatic therapies, body work, brain-based work like EMDR, so that we can help reprocess traumatic experiences and events without having to go through traditional talk therapy and spending all that time. And a lot of times you might also realize that when you go through difficult events or through stressors or trauma, sometimes we store these maladaptively held self-beliefs. So they're not adaptive memories, they're not adaptive beliefs. You know, I can't do anything right, I'm worthless, bad things will always happen to me. Those are sort of the trauma brain's response oftentimes to events. And so when we do this nervous system work and we start to talk about collectivism and healing collective trauma, I think it's great to have just a short conversation about the effects of trauma and what trauma is. And so loosely defined trauma or in a traumatic event is any time that you experience something in your life where you feel stuck, you feel like you can't get out, and then after it, you feel forever changed, and oftentimes in negative ways. And so for folks that have post-traumatic stress symptoms or post-traumatic stress disorder, or even CPTSD, like complex post-traumatic stress, oftentimes that leads to having behaviors of being hypervigilant, like always on guard, obsessing over order and routines, perfectionism, sometimes ups and downs and highs and lows in your mood, just in your mood regulation and difficulty regulating your mood, reoccurring thoughts, memories, or dreams about the event, or even having just a level of dysfunction in our relationships, like where there's attachment trauma, where we don't really feel safe, maybe having connections with people. And so today's focus, we have 45 minutes together. And as I mentioned, we'll allow some time for Q&A and dialogue towards the end. But one of the things we're going to talk about is globalism and minority, so we can kind of get an idea of what that's all about. We're going to talk a little bit more about collectivism. We're going to talk about codes of conduct, and we'll talk a little bit about denial and dissociation, and then some common cliches, and then how do we change norms. So you might be wondering, Minority Mental Health Month, what is that? I'm glad you asked. So National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month is observed every July, and it brings awareness to the unique struggles that racial and ethnic minority communities face regarding mental illness or mental health in the US. And interestingly enough, the very first Minority Mental Health Month was celebrated way back in 1915. So this has been going on for some time now, and it's just becoming a little more popularized, thankfully, for community organizations and national organizations like NAMI. The origin of National Minority Mental Health Month was in the early 1900s, as I mentioned, and at first was sort of started as like National Negro Health Week by Booker T. Washington. In 2002, National Minority Mental Health Month received support from the U.S. Congress. And July is B.B. Moore Campbell's National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, which is also known as BIPOC Mental Health Month. And the theme of this year, 2023's Minority Mental Health Month is culture, community, and connection. So we're going to be talking a little bit about all those tonight: culture and community and connection. And one thing I want to say about culture too, to me, that I love to debunk cliches and like stereotypes and things like that. Culture and color, culture is not color, it's different. Like you can have a similar culture of someone that grew up in the same regional area or the same socioeconomic class, or perhaps maybe even like religion ties into that. There's different factors, language, cultural norms that tie into what makes a certain culture or group behave in a certain way. So culture and color are different, and I wanted to point that out. And so defining minority, an ethnic or religious or linguistic minority is a group of persons which constitutes less than half of the population of the entire territory of a state. And so these are members who share common characteristics of culture, religion, language, and a combination of any of these, as I mentioned. And so when we think about minorities in this country, you think about less than half the population of the entire territory, and it kind of helps us wrap our mind around it. Now, if we look at the next slide, we'll think about it from a global perspective. There was a term that came up in sociology, and some of you might already be familiar with it a little over a decade ago, but it was this idea of like people of the global majority. So the global majority is a collective term that refers to people who are Black, African, Asian, brown, dual heritage, indigenous to the global South, and or have been racialized as ethnic minorities. And it's a term that encourages the recognition of the historic delegation of the aforementioned peoples as minorities, despite the data suggesting that they make up over 80% of the world's population and therefore the majority. So if you ever hear people say people of the global majority, you'll understand that they're talking about the diaspora, like the planet, the majority. And then if we're talking about the United States, minority is defined in that way. So I think that's really important to understand. So collectivism stresses the importance of community. Now, for me, for example, I have Indigenous, Afro-Irish roots. So a lot of the things that I learned growing up were from an Indigenous people or Native people perspective and Afro-Native perspective. And a lot of it was about like community and like having a sense of allegiance to community, a sense of pride, and also like sort of like you're kind of the idea of like, you know, if one of us is succeeding, but one of us is hurting, we have to pull the other person up by the bootstraps or pull them up together so that we can do well or thrive as a collective, as a community. Individualism is focused more on the rights and concerns of individual people. And I think, you know, I think after Puritanism and to some extent colonization, there was a lot of like ideas of like, you know, every person for him or herself. And in collectivism, unity and selflessness or altruism, they're value traits. And the independence and personal identity that are promoted in individualistic cultures differ from that. So one of the things that when we're talking about, you know, in our talk tonight about collective dissonance or collective dissociation, so we're thinking about how do groups of people create norms within those communities over time. And the concept of collectivism can be helpful or harmful depending on how we live it out. And I really want to point that out because, you know, the idea of altruism, the idea of working together, of having harmony, of looking out for your fellow person, I think can be one of those things that's very helpful. Where it can be harmful is if we adopt cultural norms and group norms that maybe are hurtful, that are ignoring the pain of another person, that are ignoring the suffering, or that are making excuse for oppression, for disease processes, for disordered thinking. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that down the road in our presentation tonight. But how we live out collectivism has a lot to do with if we can determine if it's helpful or harmful. So this is a bit blurred, but basically what I want to do for you is kind of highlight what dissociation is. And basically it just goes through what the American Psychological Association defines as dissociation. I'll pull up a note here so that I can read it to you and you can get a better idea. So the American Psychological Association provides a definition of dissociation as a mental disorder. And it talks about having like conflicting impulses that are kept apart from ideas or feelings that are separated from. And it talks about examples of dissociation, which include depersonalization, which is feeling detached from yourself. Sometimes when I work with clients or patients that experience depersonalization, you know, they'll say, gosh, it just feels like nothing is real for me anymore. It's almost like I'm just walking and going through the motions. Or derealization, which is another type. In this type of dissociation, individuals experience a sense that their surroundings are completely foreign to them. And sometimes people describe this as like feeling like they're walking underwater, you know, like things are muted out somehow, or like they're almost like trapped in glass and people can't really hear them. It's like this disconnection from experiences. And dissociation often happens when the nervous system becomes overwhelmed, when you feel inundated. Sometimes we even call this dorsal vagal collapse, when our vagus nerve and our system just completely shuts down. And it's not that we're trying to be jerks. It's not that we're trying to be dismissive. You know, a lot of you here, you might have heard of the term fight, flight, or freeze. But there's fight, there's flight, there's freeze, and there's fawn. And we don't talk about fawn a lot. Sometimes fawn is the people pleasers of America. Where are all the people pleasers tonight? Don't actually raise your hand. Okay, you raised your hand. That's okay too. I love your vulnerability, which is another thing we need to embrace as a collective. Vulnerability. I am recovering people pleaser. I think I'm recovered-ish, right? But sometimes that placating or that fawning, you know, like just like in the wild when there's like a possum, it's like, it's not really dead, but it's like, I'm going to play possum because I'd rather pretend to be dead than to have to deal with conflict, than to have to deal with predators. And so the fawning can be just as harmful and can get in the way as freezing like a deer in headlights, as going into fight mode. And sometimes people will say, well, I don't fight, but these are the people that also want to constantly address everything right away, because it's like their anxious attachment or their anxiety won't let them let things go or wait and put them aside for a little bit. And then of course there's a flight. This is like, okay, I just got to go. I can't deal with it right now. Let's talk about it later. And sometimes later, it's like later o'clock turns into never o'clock and it never happens. But dissociation happens when we feel inundated, like there's nothing that we can do. And I think for a lot of communities of color in particular, if there have been systemic oppressions over time as it relates to medical care, as it relates to education, as it relates to interaction, in corporate settings with law enforcement, if there's microaggressions and also macroaggressions, and if there's a sense of oppression within those communities that feels layered or nuanced, after a while, it's like, well, I've heard people say, well, what's the point of talking about it? Because no one can do anything about it, or this is just the way it is. You know, some of the cliches that we'll be jumping into later are like, you know, just get over it, just move on, you know, forgive and forget, be the bigger person. It's not that bad. You'll be all right. You know, like it's all these different excuses to sweep things under the rug, because sometimes the systems for minorities, they feel like, well, we feel like, well, if we reach out for help, we may not get the help that we need, or we may cause more harm to ourselves or our community. So let's just keep it quiet. But then that puts people lower on the totem pole, because it's like, well, then where do the helpers go when they need help in these communities? Dissonance happens when there's a distance between truth and what people want to believe, especially inconsistency between the beliefs that one holds, or between one's actions and one's beliefs comparatively to cognitive dissonance. So, you know, if we look at, for example, if you all think about some of the common mental health disorders that affect all people and people in minority communities. And these are some statistics. You can go on to the healthyhumanservices.gov website, or you can go to NAMI's website, but it talks about mental health disparities and just a little snapshot. So we can have collective dissonance. And you see how it says the difference between the truth and what people actually want to believe. We can have that dissonance, and we can say, oh, well, maybe it's not that bad, or it's not that big of a deal, or no, we don't really go through that. But then if you look at it, in 2021, it was estimated that only 39% of Black or African-American adults, and 25% of Asian adults, and 36% of Hispanic or Latino adults with any mental illness were treated, compared to 52% for non-minority communities. And so this shows where there's sometimes maybe a lack of access to resources, but also sometimes maybe a lack of awareness to what resources are available, but then also maybe a lack of feeling empowered, emboldened, supported, and even reaching out or accept or admitting that those issues or healthcare needs are present. One study suggests that Hispanic men who identify as LGBTQIA experience higher rates of body image disorders. And according to the Veterans Health Administration and Department of Veterans Affairs, American Indian or Indigenous people and Alaskan Native veterans reported experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder at double the rate than non-minority communities. And then finally, so like, again, if you think there's a dissonance, or you think this isn't real, or it doesn't really affect us, in 2020, suicide was the leading cause of death among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And it was the second leading cause of death among those that were aged 20 to 34. So things like, oftentimes when I work with minority communities, things it's almost like these are taboo words like addiction, abuse, anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, suicide, body dysmorphia. And sometimes the minority communities will say stuff like, they'll keep saying things like at events and things like, oh, maybe I ate a little bit too much, or, oh God, I really just have to start this diet immediately. But they'll never say, gosh, I kind of have some disordered eating problems, or the way that I see myself, I think I have got some dysmorphia here, and in particular for men in these communities. But they'll say all these things around it in a very obsessive way without actually calling it what it is. Or I've worked with a lot of communities where they say, oh my gosh, like we have beer every night. That's just what we do. Like, no, there's no addictions here. And then I say, well, how long can you go without having that beer? They're like, I haven't really tried it. This is what I've been doing my whole life, or maybe even since I was 15. For a lot of people, before they were even legally able to drink, their uncles, their aunts, their grandpas, whatever, they were already passing them alcohol. And then I say, that kind of sounds like chemical, alcohol use disorder. That sounds like chemical addiction. And they're like, oh, it's kind of like that gasp, like, we don't say that A word, Or I've heard people say, oh yeah, well, sometimes we have to break each other apart, and, our parents kind of get into it or whatever. And I'm like, that sounds like domestic violence, Or another example would be, this person took advantage of this person sexually, and this was not something that they wanted to do. It was not consensual. And I'm like, that sounds like sexual assault. So it's very difficult, I think, sometimes to say these things and give them names. It's almost like the old motif of like, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And as we do that as a collective, we make the abnormal normal. And then sometimes we scapegoat the people that identify the issue instead of addressing the issue itself, or we make them wrong for bringing it up instead of almost like making them wrong, almost making people that want to talk about mental health care in some of our communities demonize as though they're being abnormal, when in fact they're having normal reactions to abnormal patterns. So that's an overview of the difference between dissociating, completely checking out, which it can happen in small levels. Sometimes we dissociate through workaholism. Sometimes we dissociate through exercise or music. And sometimes we dissociate in a way of just checking out and almost like forgetting or suppressed memories, which is a more severe form of that. So community codes of conduct, deflecting and denying, we kind of talked about it a little bit in the last slide. So sweeping things under the rug. And I often say, Kate and friends, if we sweep too much under the rug, eventually we are going to start tripping. That is my little joke. So you're going to trip over things if there's too much there. And it's just like baggage claim in the airport. If you've ever been in the airport, if you're carrying too much, we've all probably seen that person. It looks like they're almost barely going to make their flight to their next destination in life or in the world because they're just carrying too much. And so I often say when I'm doing my work and correspondence, I'm like, mental health care is healthcare. And the same way that you go to the dentist to get prevention, you don't have to just wait and go when you are in pain. The same way that you get an oil change every 70,000 miles. This is a way of no longer sweeping things under the rug. And a lot of the clients and patients that I see, especially once they get beyond crisis or they get beyond medication management and have that regulated, they're doing career counseling and planning. They're talking about marriage and family principles and dating and healthy relationship dynamics and green flags and red flags. They're talking about family constellations and epigenetic healing and how we want to enlist lifestyle and behavior changes and nutrition so that we can change our genetic outcomes. There's laughter in therapy, believe it or not. It's not all for crisis management and acute care. Also, there's another adage, number 2, forgive and forget. This is when we weaponize religion or cultural expectations, honor your parents, honor your elders, be a dutiful daughter, don't disappoint us, don't destroy the family, these kinds of things. And I see some of you nodding your heads. These are like kitchen table conversations that happen way before it's like pre-verbal, and they become these norms. And you know what? I think a loose definition of forgiveness is letting go of the possibility that the past could have been any different. But I do not think that forgiving means that you have to then enable someone or allow or justify, abusive, harmful, draining, narcissistic, whatever it might be, behaviors. So doing that sort of forgive adage sometimes gives people a pass for really maladaptive behavioral patterns. And we use it a lot in our culture. And it doesn't mean that you are not being honoring, and it doesn't mean that you are not being a person that has faith, whatever that faith might be. If you want to address and speak about things in love and in a kind way, or in a reasonable way, I guess I should say. And I think every text, you know, whether it be the Torah or the Quran or the Bible or Sanskrit, whatever it is, I think every text talks about addressing things in truth. And so I think it is a spiritual act of courage to speak truth. And then also the third one, honoring your community at all costs. And sometimes this is when the weapon of shame comes in and suppression. You know, I've heard people say that, oh gosh, well, my grandfather said we don't talk about those things, or never bring this up again, you know, bearing things. A lot of people have heard that adage, what happens in this house stays in this house. You know, hey, as far as everybody knows, we are a normal community, a normal family, you know, and if we have to give each other those kind of speeches, that's a red flag right there. There's probably some level of dysfunction going on. Does everyone have some level of dysfunction? Absolutely. But when it starts to get in the way, when it's repetitive, when it's intergenerational trauma and it's unaddressed, right? It can cause harm, and it can also wake up our genetic predisposition for depression, anxiety, you know, for other mental health disorders, when we deny and let those things accumulate over time. Because what happens, you know, you can't just bury it and make it go away. And if you're having these thoughts, even if you're not an explosive person, you're not telling people what you're struggling with, or what you're suppressing, or where the shame is, or what you're trying to achieve your way out of, your neurochemistry is still changing, because you're firing off more adrenaline, more cortisol. So you're creating this environment for dis-ease, the disease process. So debunking cliches to heal collectively. I think some of that can happen in water cooler conversations. For those of you that everything is digital now and you don't have actual water coolers, they can still happen in your Zoom meetings. They can happen at your guys' night out or your girls' night out or whatever. They can happen at your family reunions. They can happen, you know, in your day-to-day life by, you know, basically encouraging each other to get help, to normalize it, making it a cultural norm. And even if you say things like, hey, we all need an oil change every so many thousand miles, there's nothing wrong with going to see a good psychologist, psychiatrist, or a therapist. Or, hey, medication, if you have diabetes or you have heart disease, you take medication for it. If you need the same thing to help keep your mental health in order, then you know what, by all means, we support that. We're proud of you. How can we help? You know, normalizing things like NAMI's national hotline for crisis, or the Love is Respect hotline that you can text or call to talk about healthy relationship dynamics, or the Boys Town hotline, which is for teens and parents. There's so many, the National Child Abuse hotline. There are so many resources that if we just start sharing them amongst each other more, and then encouraging each other when we do speak up, and also trying to use some I statements like, you know what, I haven't been through that exactly, but I can relate, or I can imagine that must be difficult. How can I support? You don't have to try and fix the person to do that. So debunking these cliches is one of the ways that we can heal collectively. So if you want to contact us, there is our information. We're here in Austin, Texas, but we go all over the planet to try and help humanity heal with behavioral health education and literacy. And then on the next slide, it's just a simple thank you for your time and for listening. And I wanted to try and end it enough time so that we could have some questions and answers, or if you'd like to raise your hand or share maybe something that stood out to you as a light bulb moment that you're going to take away with you, like kind of a takeaway, like, okay, I think I'll take this. This kind of stood out during the presentation. It could have been something that I said, or maybe even something that you thought about while you were listening.
So again, I'd like to thank you so much to everybody for being vulnerable with us tonight and for sharing your stories. You know, doing the personal work is healing the world in a way. And I fully believe that. So every time that you heal yourself, you're bringing us all closer to a better place. So thank you so much. And a huge thank you to Bella J. Rock. You are an inspiration. And I certainly hope that we'll be working together again in the future. You were really, truly a pleasure to learn from and to just be working with. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's so kind. Love you
Thank
guys.
you. Thank you, Bella. Thank you, everyone.
You're so welcome. Love our NAMI. Have a good night.
Have a great evening, everybody.
Thanks, Kate.